And we're on.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 12th event in the fall 2021, winter 2022 iteration of the Popular Music Books and Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbard and Carl Wilson. Next week, on December 13th, we'll have a conversation about indie labels with Jessica Lipsky, who will discuss her book, It Ain't Retro, Daftone Records in the 21st Century Soul Revolution. And Bill Kopp will also be here to talk about Disturbing the Pace, 415 Records, and the rise of New Wave. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021-22 schedule for Popular Music Books and Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Michael Barclay and Melanie Lau here, and they'll be in conversation with Owen Pallett as they talk about their respective books, Hearts on Fire, 6 Years That Changed Canadian Music, 2000 to 2005, and Modern Heartthrobs. Michael Barclay is the author of the 2018 Canadian bestseller, The Never-Ending Present, The Story of Gord Downie and the Tragically Hip, which told not only the story of one of the most successful Canadian bands in history, but also about how the singer made rock and roll history by performing with terminal brain cancer on a final arena tour. The book also explores issues of Indigenous reconciliation, US-Canadian relations, hockey, Bob Dylan's Nobel, cover bands, and the nature of performance itself. His first book, co-authored with Ian A.D. Jack and Jason Schneider, was Have Not Been the Same, The Can Rock Renaissance, 1985 to 95, about Sloan, Daniel Lanois, Cowboy Junkies, Skinny Puppy, Sarah McLachlan, Rio Statics, No Means No, Blue Rodeo, and others. Michael blogs at Radio Free Canuckistan and has worked for CBC's Brave New Faces, Exclaim, Maclean's, and contributed to Magnet. He is currently a Southam Journalism Fellow at, my thing went away. He's currently a Southam Journalism Fellow at the University of Toronto's Massey College. Melody Lau is a music journalist based in Toronto, Canada. She is currently a producer at CBC Music. Before that, she was an online writer for Much and a regular contributor to Exclaim magazine. Her work has also been published in Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, Billboard, and Nylon magazine. She is a juror for the Polaris Music Prize, the Prism Prize, and has served as a judge at the Juno Awards. And Owen Pallett is a Toronto musician, solo artist, and string arranger to the stars, including Taylor Swift, Frank Ocean, The Last Shadow Puppets, Lido Pimienta, Fucked Up, Jennifer Castle, The Weather Station, and many more. As Final Fantasy, he won the 2006 Polaris Music Prize, and with Arcade Fire's Will Butler received an Oscar nomination for the score to Spike Jonze's film Her. His latest album is 2020's Island. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Carl will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Carl will find them there at the end of the discussion. Also, feel free to post comments throughout the conversation. So now I'll turn things over to Michael, Melody, and Owen.
Hi guys, how are you?
All is well. How's Toronto for you?
Well, it's a garbage day today. It's pretty grim out there. Anyways, who wants to start off, Michael or Melody?
I believe I was going to start off. I'm going to read a bit of my intro chapter. I'm going to skip around a bit in it, so there might be some awkward pauses. And I'm still trying to manage my lighting and my bald dome, so I apologize if that affects the performance at all. I started off talking about 1904 at Toronto's Massey Hall. Prime Minister of Canada at the time, Wilfrid Laurier, stood on stage and boldly declared that the 20th century shall be the century of Canada. This was trotted out in ensuing decades as either perpetually postponed potential or just hilarious hubris from a country of underachievers. The 20th century was not the century of Canada. Canada spent the next 100 years waiting in vain for Laurier to be proven correct. But since those days, Canadian music had difficulty being heard beyond its home and native land. Canada was and is a small market. It's about 1/10 the size of the States. No one else cared how popular you were in Canada. The country itself is not exotic enough to be interesting. No radio programmer or journalist in the world would ever open a package promising a hot new artist from Canada. There's a reason that the phrase worthwhile Canadian initiative is a longstanding joke in American newsrooms as the least enticing headline ever. Canadian musicians usually need foreign record label support, ideally foreign radio and press, not to mention savvy management, luck, determination, and it helps to make music that already sounds like something that sounds like everything else that's already popular in the world. Canada's always produced global superstars, the best of which were unique and groundbreaking, people like Joni Mitchell or Rush. Others captured the zeitgeist with grand gestures inside an accepted commercial sphere, people like Bryan Adams, Celine Dion, about which there's a great book. But either way, those international success stories were just occasional flare-ups from a country often ignored. Outside their home turf, the artists in question were rarely understood to be Canadian. That all changed starting around 2000, shortly after Godspeed You Black Emperor appeared on the cover of the NME in Britain. That same year, Dan Behar of Destroyer sang that there is joy in being barred from the temple. The Canadian artist's fate was no longer superstar or bust, thanks in large part to new technology. You could be a weirdo making a record in your bedroom and disseminating it online. You might get a rave review from afar before most people in your hometown had even heard of you. If the stars aligned, you might even sell hundreds of thousands, if not millions of records without any real radio support. And it didn't matter if you were one woman with a synth and a drum machine, like Peaches, a turntablist with an absurd sense of humor, like Kid Koala, 3 folk singing tree planters, like the Bibliophonics, or a 9-member art rock collective. I mean, take your pick, there were several. And if your neighbors are doing something equally innovative or interesting, then suddenly Canada as a whole looks a lot more intriguing to the rest of the world for the first time in its musical history. Vancouver band The New Pornographers, who are actually in Toronto tonight touring Mass Romantic. They released that album in November 2000 on the local Vancouver label, Mint Records. Within weeks, the New York Times picked it as one of the best records of the year, something that had not happened to any indie Canadian act ever, especially one that was barely yet known at home beyond the cover of Exclaim magazine. The acclaim for Mass Romantic continued to spread at the same time that Toronto artist Peaches was becoming one of the biggest buzz acts in Europe, again, before most Canadians even knew who she was. Carl Newman of The New Pornographers told me, somebody came up to me at Brownies in Manhattan in February 2001 and said, hey, you know, Canada's kind of hip right now. It's getting a rep for music. You guys and Peaches. None of the other Canadian bands had shown up in the US yet. We were the only 2 with any profile. And that comment sticks in my head. It just seems so weird, us and Peaches. It doesn't quite seem like a scene. But take a look at what else came out in 2000. Godspeed's Lift Your Skinny Fists, the Weakerthans' Left and Leaving, the Deer's End of a Hollywood Bedtime Story, the Bibliophonics' Blue Horse, Kid Koala's Carpal Tunnel Syndrome, Tegan and Sara's This Business of Art, Sarah Harmer's You Were Here, Destroyer's Thief. That same year, Win Butler moved to Montreal, hoping to find people to play in his band called Arcade Fire. That same year, Kevin Drew and Brendan Canning started recording his Broken Social Scene. Joel Plaskett started his eponymous band. Leslie Feist was touring her first solo album across Western Canada, playing to a few people sitting on the floor in Medicine Hat, Alberta. The Hidden Cameras played their first gig at a Toronto art gallery. Montreal's inaugural Mutech Festival secured the city's place at the forefront of innovative electronic music in North America. The question was no longer, how did this come from Canada? It quickly became, how come there are so many great Canadian acts right now? I'll skip ahead a bit. All of this arose from a generation of kids born in the 1970s, primarily, who were raised on the pride and cultural protectionism of the Trudeau era and on the entrepreneurship of the 80s, a musically curious generation raised on Much Music, which was a Toronto-based broadcaster invested in myth-making from various regions of the country, where genres of music collided in a pre-Poptimist context. Bands like Voivod, next to Celtic act The Rankin Family, next to Toronto hip-hop pioneer Michie Mee, next to mainstream Canadian rocker Tom Cochrane, all back-to-back on Much Music all the time. This was a generation who grew up watching Degrassi High, watching The Kids in the Hall, 2 internationally successful shows beloved because they were dorky and unique and Canadian and not in spite of it. This generation learned to build up their own community, to shake off any potential inferiority complex, and then take their mission to the world, no matter how weird it might seem. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more. Should we cut right to melody? Is that what we're doing?
I think so.
Okay,
I
great.
assume. I am not going to do a reading of my chapter because it's about twice as long as Michael's intro chapter. So I'm just going to kind of talk a bit about what the book is about and why I wanted to write it. I actually had wanted Michael to go first because his book actually really encapsulates the exact time I became obsessed with music. Not to spoil too much of his book, but like he talks a bit about how that time was easier to become a music fan because of the internet and the emergence of things like MySpace and YouTube. And that was just right when I was a teenager and just starting to dig a little deeper beyond the mainstream music that I was kind of being fed, essentially. I grew up a kind of awkward person. I'm still kind of awkward, and I didn't have a lot of friends. So music really was that thing that I turned to for community, and seeing that community mentality among bands like Broken Social Scene and Arcade Fire and like their million affiliated bands was really kind of that light for me when I was still kind of stuck living in the suburbs of Toronto and living vicariously through those bands. And it was really a transformational time for me, but also obviously for Canadian music. And one of those bands I discovered during that time was Tegan and Sara, who didn't really embody that community mindset, but they're literally a community of two because they're twin sisters. And what was different about Tegan and Sara was that they had these huge magnetic personalities. Their music was what really hooked me, but their personalities was really what made me fall in love with them. Beyond that, Tegan and Sara have really become these multi-hyphenates. They're probably really well known for their activism work and advocating for the LGBTQ community, even starting their own foundation a few years ago. But if you really break down what they do, they can be considered a number of different things. Like I see them as documentarians, as comedians, now authors, TV producers. Wouldn't be surprised if they had a podcast coming up because Tegan literally pitches one to everyone she meets. Yeah, when they kind of came up around the same time as all those other bands that I love, but there was always a distinct sense of ambition that extended beyond the Canadian music scene for them. And they're always a little more pop leaning than everything else that was coming out. And with every release, they kind of strive to be more and more accessible until about 2013 when Heartthrob came out and they finally made it onto the Billboard Hot 100 for the first time. A couple of years ago, they put out their own memoir called High School, which funny enough was around the time I pitched the book, which wasn't intimidating at all because the book was really fantastic and really reflected on their teenage years before their career took off. So it's a really insightful look at what it was like for two queer sisters kind of coming into their own as people and also as musicians. But for me, I wanted to focus a little bit more on what happened next in their career, which is actually something they don't have much of an interest in writing or talking about right now. They're actually working on a second follow-up book, but it's actually about twins. So it really gave me the space to explore a different part of their lives that they didn't cover themselves in their book. And the way that I look at it, it kind of involves my own journey as a writer. Something that really intrigued me about Tegan and Sara is that they are arguably one of the more successful bands to come out of that era of Canadian music. But there's always this critical disconnect with them. They've sold a lot of records and amassed a huge fan base, but critically, I feel like the media had formed quite a different narrative about them, one that was very divisive for a good portion of like the early part of their career and often filled with everything from, you know, misogyny to ageism to homophobia. As a writer, I kind of grew up being really shaped by a lot of that writing. And as I got older, I can see more clearly now like how our roles as critics can affect musicians, both in the critical forums and public perception of who these artists are, but also like the mental health of these artists. We just live in such a hyper-responsive feedback loop now, but we forget that back then, like writers can just submit things and just move on to the next thing and not think about the reception of it. And it still kind of happens now, like I'm guilty of it sometimes. But it's, you know, we didn't have people kind of like yelling at us on Twitter in real time back then. And I spent a lot of time talking to Tegan and Sara, especially about the way the criticism had shaped them. Because if you think about it, when they first started making music, they were in their late teens, early 20s. They had just come out in high school as gay. And so they were really kind of still figuring out their identity and who they were. And so to have, you know, critics reflect back this, like this idea and this image of who they are, mainly being kind of twin lesbians from Canada, it's literally three like identifiers that they can't escape. And it's always in the first like few sentences of the reviews that you read back in the time. And that like especially really hit Sara harder than Tegan. And Sara was also dealing with a lot of like internalized homophobia that she was working with. So it created a lot of tension in themselves individually, but also between them two as a band. And it really kind of imploded around the time of 2007's The Con, which is their fifth album. And if you think about like 5 albums in that they're still dealing with this, it's quite relentless. And it's obviously very hard on them, like mentally and the way that their dynamics worked as a band. And so a lot of the book, I talked to a lot of writers who kind of helped me reflect back on that time, and also how the democratization of music criticism through social media and like diversification of mastheads has kind of moved us gradually in the right direction in recent years. But I also talked to a lot of like musicians who, you know, really got Tegan and Sara and who they were, like people who they formed their own communities with. I think a lot about Vivek Shraya, Chris Walla, Matt Sharp, and also a lot of their fans, and really just like look back at how influential their music was and how they helped mentor a lot of LGBTQ artists. So even though it seemed like Tegan and Sara were huge, it still doesn't really feel like they got the proper credit for what they did. And, you know, I think my hope is that the book, you know, reckons with the past in a way that like doesn't really shame writers or anything. I mean, I'm a writer myself, like I try and be very sympathetic towards that, unless they deserved it. But, you know, I want the book to also kind of just keep a record of how we got here, and, you know, see how music journalism and Tegan and Sara can kind of move on from here.
Great. So where are you at with the book, Melody? The version that you sent me is a second draft.
I am in between the second and third right now. Still doing some interviews, but I think for the most part, everything is pretty much there. I've done about 30 interviews for it at this point.
Wow. How is the interview? Now, Tegan and Sara have been collaborating with you on this book, very cooperative. How has the interview process with them been?
It's actually it's funny because like so much of this process was done during the pandemic. And originally, I think what it was I was only going to get one trip to Vancouver to hang out with them once. And because of the pandemic, I've been able to just be on Zoom with them like every few months. So I've actually been able to spend a lot more time with them. And it's actually turned out to be a way better process.
It's having read through the second draft, it's actually so wonderful to just, there's such incredibly compelling interview subjects. It's like you could just publish a series of interviews with them and it would just be the most wonderful read in the world.
It's actually just a transcript of all 10 hours of our conversations.
Yeah, I can believe it. And also one other thing I was wondering about is when was the moment you really decided to write this book? Was there anything in particular that kind of spurred you onto it?
I mean, in all fairness, I was asked to pitch a book. And so it was really just deciding on which artist, and because, you know, so many of the bands that Michael writes about in his book are artists I love. It was a little hard to kind of narrow it down, but like from my perspective as a writer, that kind of critical disconnect I talked about with Tegan and Sara was really interesting to me and something I like really wanted to dig more into.
Yeah, I remember, I think I actually mentioned this to you in conversation that I had a conversation with them. I think it was around the time that Sainthood was shortlisted for the Polaris. And they were talking about how they just kind of been living with this idea that critics were always going to hate them. And the fact that critics just kind of naturally just came around to liking them without them really changing anything except continuing to make records was somewhat of a surprise to them. But I myself remember too, it was just when the con came out, it was just kind of like, oh, wait, no, this is a band that we all need to be listening to now, you know? So Michael, I counted 43 bands listed in the chapters alone. And that's not even including like the bands that kind of get some coverage or, you know, even extensive coverage. Like at one point I was just like, why didn't Junior Boys get their own chapter? But then you've got some stuff in there about Junior Boys and stuff. But yeah, 43 bands and I guess 3 labels if you want to count arts and crafts. How was the culling process? Or was there any?
There was. I was initially going to write about the decade because decades are nice round numbers. Everybody loves a decade. And there was just too much. And then I started to make those kinds of decisions about who's in and who's out. And then I thought, the more I looked at it, I was like, no, the stuff that I really love, and that was also truly transformative, was the first half. So that just lobbing off 4 years and focusing on just 6 years helped a lot. And then, yeah, I mean, there are friends of mine that are not in this book, and I'll be hearing about it. There's lots. It's a huge country. It's you know, it's very hard to cover all that stuff. And there are bands in this book that I don't even like, and yet that I feel fits my thesis. The thesis being that this is when the world paid attention. So if an artist is only successful in Canada, they're likely not in this book, unless they're seen as a catalyst to something else. Like I would say that Sarah Harmer kind of was hugely influential on Leslie Feist, and Sarah Harmer is slightly known in the States and the UK, but not broadly known. She was on Rounder Records. But Leslie Feist is a huge fan and toured with her early on. So, and I'm a huge Sarah Harmer fan. So in Royal City, same thing, like much more influential and kind of like turned a certain tide in Toronto that opened its way to the Constantines, to the Hidden Cameras, to Broken Social Scene. So Royal City themselves, maybe not that important, but I feel like you have to tell that story to open the door to others. So that's kind of how I called it. And then there's people like Alexis on Fire, who, you know, are this kind of post-hardcore band that sound like nothing else I would listen to, and I don't listen to them, and yet they totally fit into the thesis and they fit into the time. And for a generation of people 10 years younger than me, they're incredibly important.
How like aware were you of the shift between the kind of identity of Canadian music in the 90s and where it became in the 2000s? Because I was kind of, I guess not yet sentient, even though I was sentient, you know what I mean? It's just kind of, I wasn't really aware of anything that was happening except what we were involved with.
And
I mean, my perception of Canadian music prior to the 2000s was, you know, all the Can Rock staples, like I'm Mother Earth, Our Lady, Peace, the Tea Party. And that was kind of all I knew.
Right. And those are three bands that were hugely popular in Canada and not really anywhere else. Although I think the Tea Party were big in Australia. But yeah, like 90s mainstream Canadian rock is hideous, frankly. It's really quite bad. And the people I'm writing about are people who decided they had nothing left to lose. Like we're not going to be something in Canada because only the most bland stuff seems to succeed in Canada. I mean, there's always exceptions, of course. And we're just going to do whatever we want, and we're going to go busk around Europe and see if it sticks, you know? Like Godspeed, what an improbable band to be successful, right? Peaches, like New Pornographers, like a super group of people nobody's ever heard of. Like it was such a strange concept, and yet that came up in every review of that band. It's like, it's a super group. It's like, really? How many people own a Zampano record? Like 0. And yeah, it was the improbability of it all. And when you have nothing left to lose, Chris Christopherson would tell you, you have a lot of freedom. So, and that created this music.
Yeah, to me, it seemed as if there was a lot more synthesis as opposed to nostalgia going on. You know, you always had your throwback acts. Robin Black, for example, I remember going to Robin Black shows in the 2000s, early 2000s, but it really felt as if people were synthesizing the 80s, synthesizing Velvet Underground, synthesizing like stuff that had happened, but creating this new modern thing. But when I first heard indie music, it was all math rock and yeah. Pretty consistently and post-hardcore. So
yeah, but I think of someone like Caribou too, right? Like I think of his approach to electronic music and his evolution as an artist. And he was heavily influenced by his close friend Fortet, Kieran Hebden. But like I don't think a lot of people were listening to Silver Apples in the early 2000s or even Can for that matter. I don't know. I feel like Caribou really melded a lot of things that weren't happening elsewhere. One of his favorite, actually I have it right here. One of his favorite records is this Vangelis record, Aphrodite's Child. If you've ever heard this, it's the weirdest fucking thing in the world. And he found it on vinyl at the side of the road in rural Dundas, Ontario. And it blew all his friends' minds. And yeah, like the reference points for all the artists in this book are super nerdy, hyper niche records, as opposed to writing a book about people who are like, I love the Beatles. That's what I thought was a common thread about all the people I was writing about was where they were coming from.
Well, a lot of it had to do with Napster too. I mean,
absolutely.
You know, I remember walking across Queen's Park and when I was 19 years old and running into Steve Cato, and he said, you need to listen to this band called Suicide. They're amazing. And then the next day he was like, you need to listen to this band called Noi. It's not N-O-Y, it's N-E-U. And these are, and like I had the Rough Guide to Rock, the big thick, I still have it. I had the Rough Guide to Rock. So I had read about all these bands, but it was a question of access. I went
to 18, 19 at the time. You're how old?
I'm 42 now. So this would have been 1999.
Right.
So I went to Neurotica and bought $30 bootleg CDs, like CDRs, because that was all that was available of Noi's first album. That was the way I heard Noi. That was the way I heard Tagamago, because that was all that was available. There were no reissues. So it was almost kind of like all these things that you could read about in rock history books, but you had no access to, or you suddenly had available if we didn't all have lucky Dundas, Ontario roadside scores, you know? What were some of the challenges that you had in writing such a broad survey? Because it does seem like a pretty broad spectrum of bands to write about. Like, did you find it difficult to kind of like corral it all together, tie it up, or did you have was that not an issue? You didn't care, you were just going to write it as it all lay?
I think a lot of writing is structure. And I think, you know, Melody knows this, Carl knows this, other people here know this. It's once you have the structure and you decide where you're going to deal with certain topics and certain artists inside a certain framework, that makes it easier. I mean, I really contemplated doing it chronologically because a huge influence for me was Will Hermé's Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, which is such a brilliant book, and one that really surprised me. You know, when that book first came out, I thought, do I need another book about CBGBs? But that book is about 10 times more than that. And he kind of opens all these doors and makes all these connections. And that's what I wanted this book to be. I don't think it's as successful, but, and I didn't write it chronologically, but take someone like Leslie Feist, who shows up in 3 different chapters. It's like, I could have told her story with Broken Social Scene and Stars and Metric. I could have told her story with Three Gut Records and Constantine's and that scene. But really her story belongs with Peaches and Gonzalez, because they really gave her a career, because she launched in Europe and they were going around playing these weird speakeasies at 4 a.m. and she's like tap dancing in gold lame while Gonzalez plays the piano. Like, and he basically produces her first big record on spec, like for free. He's like, I'm just going to gamble. We'll do this, and if it works, I know I'll get paid eventually. And when people think of Leslie Feist, I don't think they do think of Peaches, or they might not even know who Gonzalez is. And I think it's important to tell those stories through those frames.
Mm-hmm. I remember when Gentleman Reg played me Monarch, the very out of print Leslie Feist debut album. I remember the first track, It's Cool to Love Your Family. Yeah. He's playing for me. I was like, this is really good. And he's like, yeah, she doesn't make music like this anymore. She's bitch lap lap now. Referring to her persona as Peach's sidekick. Yes. Anyways. So Carl, do you want to moderate, do a Q&A sort of situation going on?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't gotten too many questions in the chat yet, so people can do that. But I'll open up. This is sort of going off of your last question, Owen, which is, I think in both the cases of Tegan and Sara, and then the whole sort of scene from the early 2000s into the late 2000s, I think in Canada there was a foreshadowing of the kind of genre eclecticism that we talk about now as a commonplace in the scene, and definitely Michael's book has to deal with that. But it's I'm just curious from both of you, the way that you think that, like, as the internet and other things broke down those kind of individualized genre scene barriers, how that affected the sound of Canadian music in that decade.
Melody, I'll let you go first.
I mean, for me, it's like specifically about Tegan and Sara, and it's so much in their DNA to just kind of keep transforming their sound. Like when they first came out, I think a lot of people categorized them as folk. And you know, you can argue they were, but I don't think they were. And then they went into indie rock, which is kind of where it intersects with Michael's book. But for them, I think the internet was really helpful in just kind of finding that community for them, because they write music as just sisters and they don't really collaborate with a lot of people. I think they're very isolated, and they never really felt like they were a part of the Canadian music scene. They didn't really sound like anyone else. They didn't sound like Social Scene or Arcade Fire, even though they kind of, like Sara specifically, you know, would feel jealous or like kind of intimidated by that scene. But for me, it just feels like they kind of went on their own journey.
And yet their third and fourth record were made by the new Pornographers, JCDC production team. who they like say were like they were like the weird drunk uncles who like help them craft those records. And Mass Romantic was a record that kind of made them want to pick up electric guitars again, which they did when they were teenagers and then were acoustic for many years. So I think New Pornographers had a big role in their career.
For sure. But it's funny because like the West Coast sometimes can feel so isolated from, the Montreal, Toronto scene that, their only kind of real ties to that scene are people who don't feel like a part of the Canadian indie rock scene.
Yeah. Because I mean, they started signed to like this very traditional Toronto management company, bands like Lowest of the Low and the Waltons, and later on like Serena Ryder and acts like this, very much kind of can folk thing. And they were like, they knew that that they just weren't going to be, that being so young, being queer, that they're just going to face so many obstacles there. And then they didn't have a manager for years, actually, right?
Yeah, I mean, they have such a great like sense of kind of business because they had to run so much of it on their own. But yeah, it's like they do kind of feel like this outlier in the rest of the music that you cover in your book. I'm actually so curious, like, how do you think Tegan and Sara fit into that scene, like in your writing?
Yeah, I don't know that they do in a way. I mean, I was trying to think of where to put them, and then the New Pornographers kind of answered that for me. But just speaking of the manager thing too, many acts in my book didn't have a manager and kind of like blundered along. I think about like the first 5 or 6 months when Arcade Fire was taking off, they were like very cautious and kind of keeping everybody at bay, and didn't get a manager till shortly before they played Coachella, I believe. And then our band like Wolf Parade never had a manager, and it kind of shows because they've made a lot of terrible business decisions. New Pornographers too, I think, were managerless until like maybe 2007 or something. There was a real DIY spirit to all of this.
Dan Snaith has no manager. He does all his own bookkeeping, and he's really good at it.
Dan Snaith of Caribou, yeah, I'm sure, yeah. So I think that, and some people proved very hard to manage, like hidden cameras. But yeah, or Godspeed again. Like these are all very, very independent-minded people, and in that sense, Tegan and Sara definitely fit into that aesthetic. But to Carl's question too, a band like Broken Social Scene, when that record came out, every review was like, "This is a mixtape. Like every song is so different from each other. There's kind of a sonic palette, but it's very much like Yola Tango's "I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One" or something, like where you're constantly shifting gears. And I think that record in particular presaged what you were talking about, Carl, kind of the like just cross-pollinating a lot of different sounds on the same record, a microcosm of that moment.
Maybe just as a follow-up to that, Michael, like as a writer, your previous sort of big survey book, Have Not Been the Same, dealt with the sort of Canadian indie music world in the 80s, mostly in the 80s, yeah, and into early 90s. But this book has to corral a lot of, this is kind of an extension of the genre question, has to corral people whose audiences were not nearly as overlapping as a lot of the audiences for that music was. And I wonder how you felt challenged about introducing people who might be picking the book up for one particular set of artists to another set that they might not be thinking about, whether it's Alexis on Fire or whether it's, a country leaning act, all of those kinds of different things.
Well, again, I'll go back to Will Hermé's book. I think the brilliance of that book is that he makes you care about all those people by writing chronologically and weaving it together. I chose not to do that in part because I didn't think I could, because I think that's a whole other level of talent. But it also gives the reader the option. It's like, if you don't care about Fucked Up, don't read about them. Like there's that kind of like aggressive music chapter. And if you don't care about the great Alberta country singer Cor Blund or the BC folk band Bigatanyas, don't read about them. You might be interested in Kathleen Edwards, who is also a big part of the story. I mean, the way the book is written, it's pretty easy to pick and choose what you want to read about. And that, I feel like that's how people receive books anyway. Like somebody picks up a book like mine, the first thing they're going to do is look at the index to find their name because it's Canada and everyone will expect to be in it. And then, they'll flip through it. Like, I'm not actually confident that a lot of people will read this book beginning to end. I hope they do, but realistically, because of the breadth of what I'm writing about, I'm not entirely sure they would, as opposed to a book like Melodies, which is quite focused on one artist and bringing different themes into that.
Eric, do you want to ask your question?
Absolutely. I just wanted to bring Melody more into the conversation around Tegan and Sara, who sadly I don't know as well as I should. And I want to maybe open this up for people like me who are a little less versed. Can you sort of take their story up to the present a little bit and talk about kind of where they're at in your minds, what they've achieved in their mind, what they've achieved, or, like sort of how do you see them? How do they see themselves? What are sort of the ongoing things for them to be? I could just use some more of that to kind of get situated.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Tegan and Sara's career has always kind of moved towards the pop sphere, and that is, they were unlike a lot of like the bands that Michael talked about, like they were heavily influenced by mainstream artists. They got into music because they loved Nirvana and Hole and Green Day, and they kind of discovered like Ani DeFranco and those acts that people more associate with them later on. But I think at the core of what they do, they always really write really good hooks, and it's always kind of like led towards. So if you're a fan of Tegan and Sara, like 2013's Heartthrob, which is kind of known as their pop breakthrough, shouldn't come as a surprise to a lot of people. And some people might see that as kind of their peak, but like what they did was they really kind of like made a space in the mainstream for queer artists, and I do think that is a huge part of their legacy. But also, like, because when you think of queer acts in the mainstream, you think so much of like Melissa Etheridge or Katie Lang. There's like this generational kind of divide between them and when Tegan and Sara started, because they were teenagers. There weren't really a lot of artists who were out and queer and that young. And so I feel like so much of their career has been powered by this, desire to create space for other queer artists. And so much of what they do now and that they're so proud of is kind of mentoring the next generation of those acts. Like they're kind of smaller and less well-known, but like Alex Leahy, Shura, like a lot of these bands are bands that they've brought with them on tour, and kind of really like they put the time into mentoring these people and like preparing them to kind of be in the music industry, especially as queer artists. And like where they're at now is kind of like that multi-hyphenate kind of role that I talk about, is that, music is still so much at the core of what they're doing. They're supposed to, I think, put out a new album next year. It's been a few years. But since then, they've kind of expanded to working on books. Like at the core of what they do, it's also kind of storytelling. And so through all these ways of like, turning their book into a TV series soon, and all these other things that they're working on that I can't really talk about. But they've really kind of expanded into this, like, I think Tegan described it as almost an empire, because I think it took them a very long time to, again, kind of come into their identities, especially as like queer public figures, that there's so much pride in what they do, and they're so much more self-assured about it, as opposed, if you kind of go back in the past, that might not necessarily be the case in some of the interviews that you read of theirs. But it's so much of what they do now is just kind of like being very proud of what where they are and like what they've done, and really being upfront about it and not being kind of shy about it.
I think it's interesting, this period of time too was very queer in Canada, not on large, but I mean, a band like the Hidden Cameras was a very new thing in Toronto at the time. I mean, even earlier, Katie Lang, obviously, major figure from late 80s, early 90s. The Organ from Vancouver, Gentleman Reg from Three Gut Records, Rufus Wainwright, shortly before the time period I'm talking about. And it was just also a period of time where I think because of in the post 9/11 world and American hegemony, being questioned, Canada was suddenly interesting. Like there was all this like, what's going on with Canada? They're legalizing gay marriage. They're decriminalizing medical marijuana. They're not going to Iraq. We did go to Afghanistan, but we didn't go to Iraq. I felt like that was the lens through which a lot of this time period was viewed, about how I think people were finally realizing how different Canada was from the States. And it was also interesting to me that there were many queer acts at the forefront of that.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is because also like the internet wasn't where it is now. So it was hard for Tegan and Sara to find any kind of like other queer acts that were their age or queer scenes, because like they just, they didn't know what was happening in Toronto at the time. They were in Calgary, and then they moved to Vancouver where there is a queer scene there, but I'm not entirely sure how close they were with that.
That was going to be my quick follow-up question, which was sort of, I guess it's a sort of two-part thing. Do Tegan and Sara value their Canadianness particularly, or is it much more lines of queer identity and queer networking? And similarly, do they value indie-ness, or as you were sort of hinting at, are they more interested in the legacy of all those Canadian artists that we don't particularly think of as Canadian? We just think of them as people in our pantheon.
Yeah, I don't think they actually like put that much thought into their Canadianness. I think the only time that really comes up for me is, obviously during that time that Michael's book covers, when the Canadian music scene really is kind of blowing up. Sara kind of felt like she was left out of it, and she was living in Montreal and she was seeing all these bands kind of like, become huge, mostly Arcade Fire. That was like her big thing was at Coachella, they literally played before Arcade Fire. So it was like literally the shadow that was cast over them. But sorry, what was the other part of your question?
About whether, in addition to feeling somewhat distance from the scene, whether they felt distance from the notion of indie-ness as this thing to value versus just trying to be big.
Yeah, no, I mean, they wanted to be part of that indie rock scene. Because of the geography of where Sara was living and kind of just being in the middle of the Montreal scene blowing up, they wanted to be in the indie rock scene. So much of the second and third album specifically of theirs was made with indie rock in mind as the sound. But, I think part of that feeling sort of rejected from that scene and feeling rejected by, critics who were covering them and, treating them not the same way that they're treating like Social Scene or Arcade Fire, that I think they just naturally wanted to reject that scene after a while and just go for something different.
I have a question for Owen. What do you remember about Coachella 05? You played that, didn't you, with Arcade Fire and Tegan and Sara right before?
Yeah,
I
do. I remember. I saw Tegan and Sara set. Yeah.
What do you remember?
Well, to be quite honest with you, I watched the set with a certain amount of bias, and that bias was you were talking about how there was this kind of like a queerness to what was going on, but the truth is, in my perspective, at any rate, queerness was existing in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was just much more compartmentalized and did not feel primed for public consumption. For gay people, it was circuit parties. And for lesbians, it was folk festivals. And there was this stuff going on. I remember, we used to go to Ember Swift concerts and stuff like this. I remember the moment where you get to the end of the song and you go bling, 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 on the guitar. And when I saw Tegan and Sara's set, I saw it entirely from this bias of this is lesbian folk music, because it was 2005 and I didn't know anything about this band except what I'd read in the press and what I'd seen and I liked it. In fact, Reg, who's come up a lot in this conversation, Reg was a big fan and Reg was always trying to get me into them. But it wasn't really until they recorded The Con, which was, I think, their first record with Chris Walla. Is that right, Melody? Yeah. So it wasn't really until they started working with Chris Walla that it was just kind of like, oh, suddenly it's, it sounded like kind of like radio indie, and it sounded ironically more like New Pornographers than it sounded like when they were working with JCDC or whatever they were called in Vancouver. But yeah, that was my perception of it was just that they were battling against this kind of preconceived notion. It was the thing too with the hidden cameras. When the hidden cameras came out, the very idea that you would have a gay band, I'm like, what precedent did we have for that except, well, what was that gay band called? Imperial
Teen.
Imperial Teen. Yeah.
Pansy Division.
Well, no, I mean, homocore Riot Girl was, you know, a different sort of thing. But like in terms of this kind of like almost like gay pop kind of music, there was not a ton of precedent for it.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask you, what do you remember about Arcade Fire's Coachella set? Because to me, that struck, the reaction to that seemed to be the confirmation of like, there was 6 months of people discovering the record and talking about it. And then that seemed to be the moment when it was like, okay, this is now a thing.
Well, I mean, I don't know what to tell you, except this will just make everyone, you know, just smirk because they know how I am. But all I remember about that show was fighting with the management because they wanted to bring in somebody else to do sound.
Right.
And they did. And so Sharon didn't do sound that day.
Right.
That's what I remember the set.
Okay.
We have a question from Anna. If you want to unmute Anna and ask. You there, Anna? She was a second ago.
Also, Paul had his hand up a little while back.
Hello,
too.
hello. Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. So my question is to all the three of you, asking whether you think there is anything like a West Coast regional indie scene that connects Canadian indie artists with those of Seattle and Los Angeles and Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco. Because I've learned about some of these artists that you mentioned, new pornographers, more particularly through KCRW, which is a very well-known radio station in Los Angeles, with a focus on indie music. So that was around the mid 2000s or something like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections. KCRW in particular was important. KCRW, to my understanding, was the first kind of successful commercial radio station to broadcast online. So it kind of had a wider audience than just the Los Angeles area. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. And the Toronto band,
Yes, definitely.
The Toronto band Stars, who was I think still based in Brooklyn at that point, that was their first break. Like their first EP got picked up by KCRW, and then because it being in LA and the demographic of that station, a lot of Hollywood people listen to that station, a lot of music licensors listen to that station,
Right.
And they credited KCRW Play with basically like funding the first few years of their career, and they were headlining shows up and down the West Coast before they could even fill a 300-person club in Toronto. So Stars is one example of
Exactly.
that, and that's on the pop side. And then on the kind of punk side, there's all this stuff in Victoria, on Vancouver Island, that really felt connected with San Diego in particular, bands like The Locust and I'm trying to remember the name of that record label. Was it? It was initials. It wasn't ESG. Does anybody remember what I'm talking about? Gold Standard Labs and all that, like where the Rapture came from originally. Anyway, you know, a band like the Rapture that started in San Diego would come up to Victoria and play like a house party at the guy from Hot Hot Heat's place, right? And Wolf Parade and all those people. There's a lot of San Diego dialogue, I think, between Victoria and San Diego in particular. And Vancouver Victoria acts have always toured the West Coast. I mean, going back to DOA and No Means No, and even the Winnipeg, like the Weakerthans from Winnipeg. John Sampson told me that he used to play in a band called Propagandhi, and they mostly just played the West Coast. He says, I was in the band for 5 years. I don't think I ever played Toronto with that band. So yeah, I mean, there's very, latitude plays a large, or longitude, totally blanking, plays a large role in touring decisions like that.
And also, I think fans drive up and down the coast to my son among them,
Yeah.
to listen to somebody in Vancouver or Seattle here or there. And I think Canadians also travel down to to the US for the West Coast cities. It's
Yeah.
very musically kind of active and exciting.
Yeah, there's definitely a whole West Coast aesthetic that's distinct from Central Canada and East Coast US for sure.
Yeah, that's true. Although we could also note that there was at least for a little while a kind of symbiotic Portland-Toronto connection as well, where there was like particular exchanges back and forth where people were going out there to like hang out, and people in Portland were hanging out in Toronto for a while because I think the scenes felt like they had something in common. Paul, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. My question's partly for Michael because of the books you've written, but I'm also interested to see what Melody how you might answer this question as well. Given that, Michael, your books have been up to 1995, the one you did with Jason, and then 2000. I know kind of what you think about the music that came in between, and you were mentioning it earlier, but if someone kind of made you write that book that was, 1996 to 99 or whatever, about the industry, what would that be about? Like, what's the story that gets from the period you wrote about before to this one? And is it just like everything falls apart and gets rebuilt, or is there something else going on in that period that gets you from that Ken Rock Renaissance to this?
Well, that's where there's a split between my personal taste and commercial reality. So if I was writing about commercial reality, I would write about Big Shiny Tunes, which was a series of CDs put out by Much Music, the MTV equivalent in Canada. It's just kind of 90s radio rock primarily. And there actually is a book written about Big Shiny Tunes. I forget what the imprint is, but it's similar to the 33 1/3 format, one of these small book things. And I think it's hilarious because I disagree with everything in it. But it's written by a guy who's clearly a fan and loves I, Mother Earth and loves Zucker Baby and all these kind of weird things to me that were like very big on commercial radio at the time, including Limb Lifter, whose drummer went on to the New Pornographers. So that's probably the reality of what Canadian music was in the late 90s. It was also a time when hip hop was really stalling to take off. And I talk about that a bit in my book. People like Chauclair, people thought would be the first huge rapper from Canada. And he did well domestically, but not so much anywhere else. And in terms of I was going to write a book, well, actually, there is another book in progress that we should mention, which is James Keast of Exclaim magazine, a national kind of music Bible here. So he is currently writing a book specifically about a 1996 Sloan show in Toronto and there were literally maybe 20 opening acts. It was like an all-day festival in 3 different stages. And so that was when Canada's East Coast was particularly captured the indie underground. So people like Joel Plaskett's Thrush Hermit, Matt Murphy's Super Friends, Eric's Trip, all that kind of scene. And then, but also at that show were Carl Newman's Zampano, Mystery Machine from Vancouver, and then all these Toronto bands, Change of Heart, 13 Engines, kind of iconic 90s Toronto bands. So I think James Keast is writing the book that you're talking about. That would be the bridge from Have Not Been the Same to Hearts on Fire. And Melody, as a young listener at that time, what do you remember of Canadian music in the late 90s?
Yeah, unfortunately, I was born in 1990, so I was about 6 to 9 around that time.
Formative.
And yeah, oh, for sure. I just don't know if I think my music listening around that time was probably just like Backstreet Boys and Spice Girls. And then, specifically through the lens of Tegan and Sara, they too were also like very young. But I would recommend Andrea Warner's book, We Ought to Know, which talks about kind of I think 4 Canadian female like pop artists at that time that really blew up. So Sarah McLachlan, Shania Twain, Celine Dion, and who's the 4th one?
Shania Twain, Alanis. Did you say
Alanis? Sorry, yeah, Alanis.
Yeah.
Would highly recommend that one. That's a really good book.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I think that one thing that maybe our PMBiP American majority audience might be interested to hear you talk about is what influence the sort of governmental cultural support structures that we have here that they don't have there, what influence that had or didn't have on the artists that you're writing about, and how that shaped or didn't shape those scenes.
you want to take that first, Melody? Because
I feel like you cover it a lot better in your book.
I have a whole section called Bay of Funding.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. There's definitely more support here. It's in typically Canadian fashion, there's not as much support as there is in Europe, and there's way more than there is in the US. And the Canadian system, and maybe Owen can speak about this too, it mostly rewards people who are already successful. So if you're starting out, it can be very difficult to get that money. I think it's improved a lot over the last 20 years, but certainly in this time period, you needed to have a distributor, you needed to show you've sold X number of copies before you get a recording grant. It wasn't terribly easy. And the funding system did promote a lot of mediocrity, and a lot of the artists I talk about didn't get a lot of funding early on. And a label like Three Gut Records never got government support. Even the band like the Constantines, Steve Lamke told me that they never got any grants at all, and nor has his more recent label called You've Changed Records. So I don't know that really the funding system funds innovation and the most interesting artists to me. But it's certainly a boon, and you just can't underestimate its effect on the infrastructure that exists in Canada. Because again, Canada is 1/10 the size of the US. So a very small market. And if you're making any kind of non-commercial music, obviously the market is even smaller than that. But one thing that does help a lot is tour support. And there was a new program with a terrible name called Radio Star Maker that started that time. And that was yet another pool to dip into. And that would kind of cover an artist's costs. Again, no one can correct me on this. It would pay for your crew, basically. And ensure that you wouldn't lose your shirt. And that's not money going into the artist's pocket. That's just like making sure you don't lose your shirt. And then John Sampson of the Weakerthans told me that his theory about why there were so many large bands. I mean, think about this time too. This is a time of, the White Stripes, a duo. This is like, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the Gossip don't even have a bassist. The Black Keys, like minimal bands. And meanwhile, Canada has, Black Mountain, Broken Social Scene, Hidden Cameras, all these huge things. And John Sampson said, the reason for that is healthcare. Like can you have a band that large without kind of basic government social structure support? I don't know. Maybe Owen can speak to the role of funding, or if it's not a terribly interesting topic, but.
I mean, I think it is kind of interesting because people don't really know about how it works, and it is better than it was. It seemed as if and I mean, this is just my perspective on it, so I mean, this isn't gospel truth or anything like that, but my perspective on the early 2000s was that there were different granting institutions that did different things. And the institution that would have been available to fund a lot of the indies, like you mentioned, like Constantine's and Three Gut and so on, these were juried. It was always a juried process. And I never served on a jury, but I heard from people who were acting on these juries, and these are old guard musicians. These are people, and this was the early 2000s. Like, people didn't really know what was going on. People did not have any time. I had a conversation, in fact, with a jury member who denied money to Sarah Harmer and was talking at length to me about how they felt you were here had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And I was disagreeing with her at the time. Radio Star Maker, on the other hand, is strictly just a tiered process. You have to go to them and say, we have sold X number of copies, give us X amount of dollars. Here are our expenses. And it was always, and this is an institution that would give money to Shania Twain. It was strictly industry stimulus. You can poo-poo it all you want, but I mean, the operating budget is, a decimal of a percentile of how much money we give to Canadian logging, for example, So Factor has really stepped up with the federal government getting involved in it. A lot is made every single year that the list has come out about, Grimes gets X amount of dollars, but I go through the list and I see all these people, musicians who I like, who I haven't even thought about in 20 years, who I'm glad to see are still getting money. Some random, Kowali singer based in Prince George or something like that. I'm just kind of like, oh, that's great. I'm so happy. So it's definitely a change process, but there were kind of different limbs that weren't really maybe offering, you know, and two, a lot of institutions, a lot of artists and artist groups just never elected to try and solicit it. Like Blue Fog, Brian Taylor, you know, who runs that label that works with Rick White projects and
Eric's Trip related things.
Eric's Trip related projects has just never applied for funding. Wolf Parade never applied for funding. Arcade Fire have only recently started to kind of get the kind of industry stimulus sort of money that was coming to you. So, but yeah, it was terrific to get all of your touring budget funded. And at the same time, as you stated, compared to what goes on in Europe, it's a little paltry in comparison. In France, for example, you basically just have to be running a career at the same level that you would to be admitted to the musicians union to have the government pay for all your air travel. Like, it's just, would they pay for it at that point? Like, it's kind of like the very concept of that happening in Canada is, you know, is kind of ridiculous. Like, it just doesn't happen here.
And Leslie Feist told me about her French record deal that she signed in 2004, that like there were no recoupable costs or something. She's like, the French record deals just have like a totally different approach than North American record deals. And, you know, she just feels so lucky to have got into that from day one.
Well, I mean, I always like to remember that this article I read that stated that if you track the civilizations that last the longest, the ones that last the longest are all the ones that had the highest amount of arts funding.
Yeah, put that on the ballot.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anyone else who wants to speak up with a question? I'll give you a moment now. Marin, I've seen you in the chat a little bit. Tab, I see you there. Chris, I see you there. If anybody else has anything before we wrap up. or Melody's got somebody at the door, so maybe we should let her go. Okay, seeing none, I will thank Owen and Michael and Melody so much for joining us today, and remind you all that next week we have this kind of dovetails nicely, a conversation about indie labels with Jessica Lipsky talking about Daptone and Bill Kopp with his book on 415 Records. And so come back and join us next week for that. And thanks everyone for coming.